dyslexia, so learning difficulties, perhaps biological factors that are causing the students to have problems. You've got the weather, yeah. At the moment in Norwich, although it looks bright and sunny and you can see the sunshine shining off my head, it's actually quite grey and dull, but we're hoping that the weekend is going to be a lot better. So what we're talking about here often is that we're not necessarily blaming the students, but we're identifying the students as an issue that is causing the lesson to go maybe badly or maybe not as well as we would have hoped, right? And what we want to address in this presentation, Joe and I, is looking at how we can acknowledge, how we can respect, how we can understand the students, and how we can adapt the lesson before we deliver it so as to make it go more smoothly, right? Now, I know that many of you might be sitting there thinking, well, the problem is with the students. The problem is with the students in terms of the background they come from, maybe that there is a lack of discipline in the background, or maybe the problem is with the students because of the situation in the school, that somebody's put, Justina's put that the groups are too large, or people have put the problems concentrating. What Joe and I are going to be suggesting is that if we pay attention more to certain aspects of the students themselves, it can help us to deliver a lesson that's more smooth, to deliver a lesson that's getting more engagement from the students. So that's what we mean by teaching humans, understanding what's going on in the minds of the students, what they bring with them. Okay, so we're looking at how we can adapt that lesson plan, both in terms of what we do in the class and in terms of how we prepare for the class, right? So what I'm going to talk about first of all is the aspect of role play, because in the communicative classroom, that's one of the things that we ask students to do often, is to play certain roles, right? Are there any of you who don't use role play in the classes? So you can drop it into the chat, and I will pay attention, I promise. Yeah. We've just had a comment here that sometimes it's difficult to predict. Thank you very much. Some people love role plays. Yep. Oh, rarely. Okay, Carolina rarely uses role plays. Okay. Sometimes. Yep. Love. Okay. So as we've got here on the slide, sometimes the issue is that you give the students a role and they say, I don't want to play that role, or that role's not interesting to me, or they'll do what you want, but they won't really engage with it. They won't get involved. They won't, put their energy into it, as I'm doing now, putting my energy into this presentation. Perfect student, you see. I wasn't always a perfect student, not a very good student at school, so I know what I'm talking about here when I'm talking about difficult students. What we're looking at is why we have these problems with students in terms of their interaction in role plays, right? So we've got a comment here: Polish students do not object to. Can you just clarify what they don't object to, and I'll come back to it. So what we're looking at is what we can do to help them or to encourage them to cooperate, right? To cooperate with us, to cooperate with the role play, to engage in the role play. And one of the things that Joe and I would say is that what we're trying to do is to respect the student's personality, to respect the student's desires, to respect the student's knowledge, what they come into the class with, that we're trying to understand that students often want to be liked by their teacher, by their peers, and sometimes that's a conflict. That wanting to be liked by the peers and wanting to be liked by the teachers is in conflict, or wanting to be liked by some of the peers is in conflict with wanting to be liked by other of the peers, right? Or it might be that wanting to be liked is in conflict with what they actually want to do, what they want to achieve, right? And that, oops, sorry, and that finally that they have delicate egos. They feel very sensitively about comments that are made to them or things that are said to them or what they're asked to do, which might be, as we've got a comment here, that they fear being laughed at. I would agree that some students, with Anna, that some students are shy about participating, but I would suggest that often that shyness is partly because we're not, and I would say in my case, that we're maybe not giving them roles that they can play with their own personality, right? That we might be asking them to play a role that is contrary to their personality, right? Or that is too much of a stretch for their personality. That's asking them to go too far from how they can do this, right? So they what Justina said about grammar exercises and feeling that they're paralyzed, I think is also in terms of the role play, that we have to scaffold it, we have to structure it so that it's not too much of a stretch. And sometimes that might be me scaffolding it or structuring it so that it's not too far a stretch from their personality or from their knowledge or from their belief, right? So sometimes I've asked a student to argue a particular position and they haven't engaged, and I've said to them, what's the problem? And they've said to me, Tony, I just don't believe this. I don't believe it's the case. And I said, well, can't you argue the counter? And they said, no, it doesn't fit. It doesn't suit me. I feel uncomfortable. And I think that we then need to respect that. We need to understand how it's affecting their ego and adapt to that, right? And adapt to. So one thing that we're asking you to do in this presentation is to think about your own situation and how you feel in different situations, right? So there are some things that you might do or you might say when you're in meetings or when you're in classes or when you're in situations. So I know, for instance, that one of the things that I say to my students is that I want them to ask questions. I want them to raise their hand when they're unclear about something. And then I will go to a conference and I will be sitting in a conference and often I will force myself to sit at the front and I will there will be a question, or there will be time for questions, and I'll put up my hand and ask the question, and then I'll turn around and I'll be looking behind me, and people are looking at me as if to say, "You asked a question. You're a bit strange," because not many people ask questions. Or I'll say something and I'll turn around to other people and I'll say, "Don't you agree?" And they'll be looking at me like saying, "I'm not talking." And there'll be a few people who will respond. So I think we need to understand that this is what's going on with ourselves as well as with the students. I was reading something very recent, something very interesting last night about two psychologists who you might have heard of, called Thomas Kahneman and Amos Tversky. Thomas Kahneman wrote a book called Thinking Fast and Slow, which is about behavioral economics. Anyway, it doesn't matter about the academic background of it. The point that they were making was that often experts will describe the way that they believe they are thinking when they're making evaluations. But when you actually look at what they are doing when they make those evaluations, or when they make those judgments, it's much simpler and it's much less complex than they think is going on in their heads. So often, in order to really understand what's going on in the heads of other people, we have to really be honest about what's going on in our heads, and be honest about what we can expect from ourselves and what we can expect from other people. So I find that with my students and with myself, that I need to be more clear about what I'm expecting of them, and is that realistic to expect of them and to expect of me. I coming back to what people are saying about passivity, I would agree that passivity is an issue, but I think that what we need to understand is that students come with a lot of baggage. Students aren't a blank piece of paper, right? They come with experiences. They come with attitudes. They come with knowledge. And sometimes that those experiences are good, and sometimes they're bad. Sometimes they've been told that they're very good at some things, or sometimes they've been told that they're not so good. I was told for many years that I was very bad at learning languages, and that I was actually told that I wasn't allowed to learn German as a second language because I was not very good at French. And then in later life, I went to France and I studied communicatively. I didn't study through a grammar translation method, and I found that I didn't become overnight a fantastic speaker, but I was able to succeed much more through communication and picking up the language and understanding the rules from communication than from the grammar translation method. And that was my baggage, that was my experience. So just to answer a couple of points that have been made in the chat, that some people are asking, what do we do in classes where there are in large classes where there's misbehavior? My experience of large classes, my experiences of large groups, is that the misbehavior often comes from an absence of limits. And what's often said is that there has to be kind of not just rules, but consistent response to what people do when they break those rules, right? That it has to be immediate, it has to be consistent, and students have to know that this is what will happen every time they break the rules. This is how it works. So that's one aspect of it. But the other aspect of it is that I think that often misbehavior comes from students who feel maybe that they're not being respected by the system, by the institution, maybe not by the teacher, but by the system, by the institution, and that then their abilities are not being acknowledged or are not being allowed to flourish. And that if you can give them the opportunity to flourish, and show that you recognize what their abilities are, then that will help the students to achieve something. And once they start to achieve something, they will then have less incentive to misbehave. That would be one of my arguments. Yeah. Okay. So moving on. So that's the idea that students come with their baggage of experiences, of knowledge, of yeah. The other issue that we want to look at here is that sometimes one of the problems that we have in terms of students misbehaving is that they find that the classroom is a very limited experience, is a very limited interaction, a very limited place to be, right? And that's in some cases the interaction between the teacher and the student. In some cases, the interaction between the student and the student. In some cases, the interaction between the student and the book. That these are limited, they're prescribed, they're fixed, they're not allowed to vary. And that what we would advocate is that if you can give the students more choice, and choice that reflects their interests, reflects their abilities, reflects the knowledge and skills that they come with, that will help them to engage. Right? So Anna has talked about the students being interested in the lessons, which I agree with, but I think interest often comes from choice, not unlimited choice, not being able to choose whatever they want to do, but choice within your lesson plan, choice within your topics that you're focusing on. So to give you an example here, this is an example of words that we might have taught in the class, or that students might have been asked to learn prior to the class, right? And those words are highlighted in bold. Describe, explain, insist on, right? What we have done here is created questions, but the question's not finished, right? So the student gets to finish the question with their own topic, right? So can you describe your favorite sport? Can you explain how to play a video game? They can choose what topics they're going to talk on, right? Or what topics they're going to write on, or what topics they're going to discuss, right? And so in that way, it allows them to access and to engage with things that they know something about, or things that they are interested in talking about, or things that they feel passionate about, and respects them as people who come with things to the class. They're not just blank. They're not just there for us to write on or to fill. They're there for us to annotate, to add to connect with. Yeah. Okay. So I'm conscious that I'm talking a lot. So my question would be, that kind of activity, would that be useful in your classes? Is that something that you think would help students to engage more? It's your opportunity to type. I'll just drink my coffee. Okay, so thank you very much for the feedback. My second question then is this something that you think is obvious? Is this something that you think is just common sense? Or is this something that you think needs to be discussed? Is it something that teachers need to think about? Okay, so we've got some people who are saying that it's common sense, that it's obvious. Okay, so coming close to the screen, what I would argue is that what is obvious and what is simple is not always easy. Okay, that we might know that something is clear, but it can be quite difficult to put that into practice, and that we need to keep considering it and we need to make it routine for it to become easy, right? So one of the examples that I give is that it's obvious to me that at 10 o'clock at night I should not go to the fridge and take out the chocolate cake and eat it, because one, it's going to increase my sugar level and I'm going to have difficulty sleeping. Two, it's going to mean that I'm not going to digest that food and it's going to sit heavy on my stomach. But three, I'm not going to use up those calories, and so I'm going to wake up in the morning and feel fat. What I have to do in order to avoid taking that chocolate at 10 o'clock at night is put into practice or put into place routines and procedures that help me to avoid doing that thing, right? And that's how I avoid making those mistakes. That's how I make it easy, is by putting those routines and those practices into place so that it becomes something that we always do, something that we always practice, right? And so I would argue that making this a part of your lesson planning and making this a part of your lesson practice with your students, that they have choice, limited choice, but choice within what they do, within the activities they have, within the vocabulary that they learn, right? It is a necessary thing to make something that is simple easy. Okay? Does that make sense? Is that clear? Is that okay? Okay. Thank you very much. All right. So moving on. Another activity that I think is a very good one, that it can be used with classes where you might need to substitute, or you might need to walk in at the last minute and you don't have very much time to prepare. This is an example of students generating material from relatively little input from the teacher with choice. Okay, so the idea is that you get them to have a piece of paper, and that piece of paper should be this way, not this way, right? So what we call landscape rather than portrait, right? That way, okay. And on that piece of paper, they mark, or they put 3 columns, 2 narrow and 1 large. And in the first column, you put the names of all the people in the class, right? And in the second column, you ask the students to decide what topics they are happy to talk about, right? Happy in terms of wanting to discuss a lot, or wanting or feeling that they can give a lot of information, right? And in the third column, the individual students, so each student with their piece of paper, then decides on questions that they will ask that particular student. So questions that they are interested in asking that student about that topic. So in this way, you've got 2 levels of choice, right? You've got the choice of the first student, which is about the topic, and you've got the choice of the second student, which is about the area of that topic which they want to ask, right? And so it's kind of it's a multiplier effect, right? That you've got choice on top of choice. Okay? Now, one of the responses that I've had from some teachers, thank you very much, Agnieszka and Ivona, about saying it's a great idea, but some teachers have said, yes, Tony or Johanna, we need to cover certain topics, right? The syllabus is limited. The syllabus says you have to cover this topic, sport, you have to cover this topic, cooking, this topic, global warming, whatever, right? So in that case, what you would do is you would say, okay, this is the general topic, right? Sport. but what aspect of this general topic are you most interested in? Right? So if the general topic is sport, what sport are you most interested in? Or if the general topic is sport, not what particular sport are you most interested in, but what aspect of sport are you interested in? Is it sport advertising? Is it sport results? Is it sport, resistance to sport, dislike of sport? Could be anything within that topic, so that you're then saying to them, okay, we want you to talk about this topic, but we want you to develop your interests, because developing your interests develops your ability to talk and your ability to communicate. And what I do when I'm working with this kind of activity is I go round the room and I'm listening to what people are saying, and I'm trying to help them to express themselves in a way that's more clear or more precise or more complex. So they might say, things like, football is a great game because it's very fast. And I say, well, fast in what way? What, the men run fast? And they say, no, of course not. And I say, well, what? And they say, fast between people. And I say, oh, the passing. There's lots of passing. The ball moves fast. And they say, yes, of course. And I say, what do you mean, of course? That's not what you said. Of course. You have to be more precise, and it's pushing them. That if they have said this is something that's interesting to them, push them to be more precise, more communicative, more detailed, right? Yeah, and coming back to the comments in the chat, I think it can help the students to form precise questions. That you could say to the students, okay, I want you to focus on these 3 question words, or I want you to focus on closed question words rather than open question words. So coming back to what people have said is that I agree that freedom can be disastrous, right? If you give too much freedom, it becomes a mess, right? But then that is the job of the teacher to decide, what are my learning outcomes at the end of this class? What is it that I want to focus on as part of this class? Is it closed questions? Is it open questions? Is it exploration of this topic? Is it rules? Right? If it's rules, what kind of grammar do we need? What kind of grammar do we want to focus on? What kind of grammar do we want to activate? Right? So, and yes, there's an interesting comment at the bottom of the chat, which is that often teachers resist freedom because it becomes problematic for them in terms of managing the class, or they worry about how the interaction in the class will be seen. But again, it comes back to the learning outcome, right? As a teacher, what are you trying to get that class to do? Is it to develop fluency, or is it to develop accuracy? If it's developing accuracy, you might want different kinds of activities than developing fluency. It might be more controlled. But that doesn't mean it has to limit totally the freedom of the students, right? Okay, so I'm conscious that we've got about 25, 30 minutes left, so I want to move on. Okay, another problem that we can have with students is how they manage group work. Right. So what I've got four issues here, or 4 solutions. Right. What I'd like you to tell me is, what kinds of issues do you have with students in them doing group work? Is it that they don't speak? What is it? And again, I'm gonna drink my coffee. Okay, so we've got issues like some of them are only a few of them are trying, only a few of them are using English, many of them are not engaged, right? So here's an activity to try and help with that, right? There was also a comment that I saw earlier on that people seem to be agreeing with, and that was where somebody was saying, Magda, I think, was saying that one of the issues, which I touched on earlier, is that in many classes, in many courses, there are a lot of topics to cover, a lot of activities to do. Right? My point would be that these are activity types, and these are ways of doing activities that you can reuse, right? So, for example, reuse with different topics. So you can cover the number of topics, but you can reuse these activity types. So, to give you an example, right? We've got here 4 roles within a group. So what you could do is you could put students into groups of 4 and get them to number themselves, right? And then you assign roles to each number, right? So for instance, one student is the note taker, student number 1. Student number 2 is the person responsible for the timing and the agenda. So to make sure that all the items on the agenda are covered, if it's a meeting, or all the tasks are covered, right? Number 3 is the person who's responsible for reporting back, being able to explain and express what was said. And number 4 is the person who's responsible for English and equality, right? And what many of you have said is that there is a lack of engagement with English. So what I've done in the past, and what I know many of my colleagues would do, is that we would make 1 or even 2 people within a group responsible for the English that is used in that group, and say to them, your one role, your only thing that you need to focus on as part of this activity is you are responsible for making sure everybody keeps on track in terms of English. And we can discuss what kind of language they can use for that, instead of just saying English, 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 or don't speak Polish, or whatever. Yeah? But they become responsible for making sure that the students stay within English, right? Now, there was earlier, somebody was saying that one of the issues that they find is that the best students spend their time talking in English and the other students don't talk in Polish. Well, then what you can do is make the best student the one who's responsible for the student speaking English. And so they can help the other students maybe to express themselves in English, right? You can equally, you could make the student, not make, but tell the student who is struggling to communicate because they prefer to listen, or they're more comfortable listening, you could make them the note taker. Or you could make them the person who reports back. Because a lot of the time what the person reporting back is doing is listening, thinking how to say it, thinking, delaying production, and then producing. And that's not a bad thing. That's just a particular strategy. I've met a lot of people in my time who don't talk as much as me, but when they do talk, they make a lot more sense than I do, unfortunately. I wish I could sometimes just shut up, listen, and then talk at the end, right? So one of the things that I found really successful with groups is giving them roles which are, 1, suitable to their personalities or suitable to the baggage that they bring with them, and 2, takes the pressure off me in terms of monitoring and making sure that what I said needs to happen, right? And finally, the thing that I would say is that in terms of helping students to prepare for later study, and especially university study, these are essential, right? So this keeping to an agenda and timing, it's massively important, because in the UK anyway, students are expected to direct their own learning, right? And students are expected to make sure that they keep on track, right? That they make sure that they are doing things according to the deadline, according to the time frame. Okay. Titania makes the good ones teach the poor ones doing. Yeah. So there's a comment here about the poor ones teaching the good ones, right? So very often, what I would do in group work is to ask to say to the good students, what you need to do is not explain, because that would be too easy. That's you using your language, but to help the poorer student to explain to you, right? And that is very useful practice for the strong students, because they're helping the weaker students to explain. Okay. All right. So moving on to another area, right? One issue that I often have, or that I often find when talking to teachers, is that they will say they will get to the end of a class and the students can't remember what was done at the beginning of a class, or they'll come to a class later in the week and they'll try to connect it to a class that was earlier in the week, and the students can't remember what they did. They like, that was the class about the present perfect. And you're like, yes, and what did we do? Right. So is this a problem that you have with having the students remember and build on what they've done earlier? Yep. Okay, good. So we're going to look at how we can help them to remember, how we can help them to build from one class to another, from one activity to another. Okay. So one of the things is for us, as we said before, to consider where we are, what we're doing, what happens with us. And I don't know about you, but I very often find myself saying these things, right? That somebody will be talking to me and they'll say, Tony, and I'll be like, oh, sorry, I was just thinking of something else. Or they'll say something to me and I'll think I'm listening, and then somebody else will ask me to explain, and I'll say, they explained it, but I've forgotten what they said. Right? So memory is an imperfect thing. That's what we have to accept anyway. Right? I did a presentation recently for Macmillan Russia, where I was talking about critical thinking, and one of the points that I was making was that critical thinking is built on memory, on what we know in the long term and what we remember in the short term, what we can pull from our long-term memory, and that both of those are imperfect things. Both the long-term and the short-term memory is problematic, right? And that we have to recognize that it's not the students often that is the issue. It's people. The brain is not a perfect memory tool. If it was, we would store things and recall them perfectly without any issues, right? So let's look at why students don't remember, right? That, as I said, the memory is a poor tool. They often struggle to focus, and they almost always, they and we, I would say, fail to review what has happened, right? So one of the techniques that I have, that I use with the students, that I make a part of each and every lesson, is at the end of the lesson, I try and leave 3-4 minutes for them to review what we did in that lesson, and for them to say what was the main point for you that you learned to take to the next lesson? Or what was the main thing that you found surprising? Or what was the main piece of language that you found that was useful, right? And I did this again. I do this often at when I do presentations, and I did it when I was talking to Macmillan Russia. And I said to the people in the session, at the end of the session, okay, I'm going to give you 5 slides. And each one of those slides has a picture which I used in this presentation. So can you tell me what those slides represent in terms of the structure of the presentation? And the interesting thing was that the first 2 slides, most of the audience got wrong. Right? That they couldn't recall what those slides were related to. Some people got it, but some people didn't. But what was the interesting thing was that not that they couldn't recall it, but by helping them to recall that, helped them to see the structure of the presentation, helped them to understand what had gone on, and helped them then to take that away. So when I was talking to people after the presentation, when I was talking to people later that night in the dinner, I got a lot more people coming up to me and saying, oh, that was interesting, and what was most interesting was at the end when you talked about the structure and the points that we'd gone through, and it helped me to remember, and it helped me to think about it, right? So I would say that that's one quick activity that you can do, and I would encourage teachers to do it at the beginning and at the end, is to review, right? Review what the previous lesson was, to review the end of the lesson, what has been done. So it helps them to go over, helps them to focus, right? But what we can also do is to link the things that we're learning to the baggage that we bring in, right? The experiences, the knowledge, the skills, right? So we are trying to connect the things that are where the input to the existing memories, the existing knowledge, the existing skills, right? One comment that's just been made is it sounds like a lot of work preparing slides for every lesson. What I would say is that you're not so much preparing slides as you're reusing the things that you've done, right? So I wasn't preparing slides for those lessons. I was presenting the information, and then I was using that information again at the end to say, okay, I talked about this. What does it represent? I talked about this. What does it represent? Right? And sometimes what I will do is I will put a series of words on the board and then ask the students to fill in the detail about what I said about each of those things as we went through the lesson. Right? Or I'll say to the students, we did 3 main things in this lesson. What are those 3 main things? It's just thinking about the structure. Right? And what we're trying to do is to get the students to connect that information to what they already have, right? That it's connecting the new to the known, connecting the unfamiliar to the familiar, right? Now, I said earlier that I talk in presentations quite a lot about how memory works. One of the things that we have learned about memory is that the way that the brain works is through connections and reconnections. There's an expression in neuroscience that neurons that fire together wire together. That if you make a connection repeatedly between 2 things, then the recall becomes automatic. That when you're presented with one thing, you instantly recall the other. The more often and the more diverse there are connections, right? The more connections you make between different things, the easier something is to recall. So you're not trying to connect one to one, you're trying to connect one to many, but doing it repeatedly, right? I agree with what's been said here. Revision is important, right? But it's diverse revision, and it's revision connecting to existing, not just going over something, but going over it, thinking about how it connects to what you already know, thinking about how it connects to other things. One of the issues that I often have with students is that when they study in one way, which is often by going over and over and over and over something again and again and again. That can be useful. Memorization, simple memorization can be useful, but memorization is often more permanent, more long-lasting when it is done in different ways, through multiple contexts, through multiple topics, right? So that we are maybe looking at food vocabulary in terms of meals that they have enjoyed, in terms of places that they have visited, in terms of times that they experience this food, in terms of scents and smells, right? Now, one of the things that was mentioned earlier is that in Poland you have a lot of different topics that you have to cover. But I would say that presents an opportunity for revision, right? So there's a question here of how do we diversify our revisions? And I would say by linking what you've done before to the present topic, right? So if previously you have done food vocabulary and now you're doing present perfect, well then use that food vocabulary in present perfect. Have you ever eaten cucumber? Or have you ever eaten squid? Or what food have you eaten that you found, and leaving a gap? Disgusting, wonderful, expensive, right? What is the most expensive food that you have ever had, right? So what I would stress is that the diversity of topics, the number of topics, can be a powerful tool if you are using it to help the students revise and revisit what they've already done, right? And helping them to build on what they've done, to build what they've already learned into what they are learning now, right? So one example of this is within grammar. It's looking at the connections, looking at the links between different kinds of grammar, that we might say that the present perfect is connecting now to the past, right? But the past perfect is connecting a point in the past to another point in the past, right? So it's connecting the past to the past before that, right? And the future perfect is about connecting a time in the future, a deadline, to now, right? So we're looking at how grammar connects in similar ways, right? And how we help students to make and remake those connections, right? People are talking in the chat about Quizlet, and I've used Quizlet myself for trying to learn languages, and I've used Quizlet with students. And one of the reasons that I would suggest that Quizlet works is because it allows students to go over the language in multiple ways, in different forms, through different kinds of games, right? Through reconnecting in different ways. Okay, I'm just going to skip through that one. One of the points, and you can see the article that Jo links to on her website, is using a vocab box, right? The idea of vocab box is that in each lesson, when vocabulary comes up that the students find interesting, the students find useful, it goes into that vocabulary box. And at the end of the lesson or at the end of the week, that vocabulary comes out and is revised because students have selected it. Right? Students have said this is useful vocabulary, this is interesting, this is necessary. So again, it comes back to this question of choice. Now, when we do this with teachers, it's massively successful. And when we do it with students, if they recognize that this is them choosing the vocabulary, this is them picking what's useful, then it can become a very powerful tool. One of the issues that I have with Quizlet sometimes is that teachers will often prescribe the vocabulary cards that the students are using and won't allow them to build their own, or will limit how much change they can make to those vocabulary cards. And I would argue that tools like Quizlet, tools like flashcards, really work when the students can adapt those cards, can personalize them for their own purposes, to help them to connect to their existing knowledge, to what they already know, right? So I think I've got 1 or 2 minutes, because Agnieszka said that I'm finishing at 10 past, right? So one of the final things I would finish with is talking about just about writing, just briefly about how we get students to think about doing work, right? Getting the work started. Because I think that as teachers, as students, we often struggle with procrastination, with delaying, with putting the work off, right? And I think as teachers we do this, as students we do this. We want to improve, we want to develop, but getting it done, getting it started, is a really difficult thing to do, right? And it might be that we're delaying because we want the instant gratification. We want to be happy now rather than putting off happiness until a future time. It might be that we're distracted. So I would argue, and I know that Joe would, that one of the things that's necessary is for us to understand ourselves, for us to help students to understand what's causing them to delay, and to overcome that through understanding what's causing them to delay. But also I would argue that it's through helping them to develop habits and to use tools that will help them to overcome those particular problems, right? So I know that, for instance, one of the things that works best for me is to have a particular focus for each day that I'm working, say, in the office, and to say to myself, okay, for this day, the most important thing that I need to get done is this. And to do that, first of all, to work on that, first of all, before I can procrastinate and start doing other things, right? Joe has highlighted a very useful tool that's called Write or Die, that you can look at on the internet. And what that does is it builds a reinforcement for you to actually complete the task. So basically what happens is that you set the time, you set the number of words that you want to write, you start typing, and if you stop, then in some of the choices, what will happen is that the screen starts going pink and then starts going red. And you have to start typing in order to get the screen to go back to white. So it's encouraging you to keep typing. It's responsive to what's going on, right? In other cases, called like kamikaze setting on Write or Die, if you don't keep typing, it will start editing, start deleting some of the writing that you've already done. Yeah. What Jo talks about in her book and on her website is about setting targets for the students. And this could be targets in terms of how many words they write. It could be targets in terms of how accurate they are in what they are able to spell, how many mistakes they make. And the idea is that at the center of the target, you have a high goal. So it might be that you're 100% accurate, or that you type 1,500 words in that day. But you have decreasing levels of goals as you work outwards in that target. So the blue might be that you achieve 750 words, or that you achieve 60% accuracy, right? And that in that the students can work towards their target. They're always achieving something. They're hitting the target. They might not be hitting the center of the target, but they're hitting the target. And I often say to myself, and I often say to my students, you have to be gentle with yourself. You have to be gentle with your students, sometimes strict, but showing them support, showing them encouragement. And this tool that Joe has shown helps you to say, look, we're moving towards a target, but we want to be searching for the highest levels. Okay, so we're talking about sharing the responsibility for learning, right? That students are reflecting on their strengths, on their knowledge, on their the skills that they come to the class with. But teachers are also responding to what the student comes into the class with, are presenting them with limited freedom, are presenting them with options, are presenting them with ways of connecting their experience to what's being learned. That we recognize that students come to the class with baggage, and some of that baggage is good and some of that baggage is bad, but we have to respect them as human beings, flawed in many ways, but human beings that we can respond to, and they have to respect us in that way as well, and they have to take responsibility for it, and we can encourage them to do that. I know that Joe just wants to say a few words to you before we finish this. She's come back, I think, with her voice rested, and mine is now almost completely gone. So I'm just going to pause this and then hand over to Joe. So thank you very much all for attending and for paying attention. Thanks a lot.
Hi. Hello. No, my voice hasn't come back. I can see now. Um, well, first, I'd just like to say thank you so much for Tony to rescuing me. Um, and I can see a lot of thank yous here, Tony. Um, yeah, so I hope it was interesting. I'm not quite sure what Tony said in my absence, but I think it was similar to what I was going to say anyway. Um, yeah, so thank you very much for coming. Um, I believe Macmillan might have some questions for me. Is that right or not? Or if anybody else has any questions.
Yes, thank you very much for the wonderful session, really inspiring. And thank you to all the teachers for wonderful comments in the chat box. Really a lot of useful ideas. We still have got some time if anyone would like to ask Johanna, as she's a Nine Online academic director and has got any doubts about courses, we can spare some more minutes. For those of you who would need to go, I can say that the certificates of attendance can be downloaded from our Macmillan page. You've got at the bottom of the page two buttons. One of them is certificate, and the other one is our special gift from Johanna, which is a methodology article called Spelling Myths, as Johanna is an expert on teaching spelling. So please do visit us in our webpage, macmillan.pl szkolenia, where you'll find a lot of information about NILE courses. You will also have a chance to download your own code, discount code, 25% off online courses and 10% off face-to-face courses. You can also see some more details at the NIELT.com webpage, where you have a section on online courses as well. And I need to mention that just this January, there are a lot of wonderful online courses coming a variety of them really, from pre-primary education through young learners, through technology, testing and evaluation, teaching skills, materials development, and becoming a teacher trainer. So if any one of you would like to ask a question regarding my courses, please type in the chat box. To be honest, I need to say that I enrolled for a few online courses, like massive open online courses, and I wasn't really successful in completing the course. And I see now online courses have got a huge completion rate. How are the courses different, Johanna, to the NIL courses different to the
Right. Yeah, you're right that we got a really high completion rate. About 89% of our students actually complete the course, which compared to other courses is extremely high actually. For massive open online courses, often it's more like 14%, 1-4, but ours are 89%, so very high. So with our courses, there's a maximum of 16 people, that's 16 people on a course, and you work with a tutor, and the tutor really is really part of the course, and I think that's one of the biggest differences. We really we rely on the participants actually doing a lot and collaborating, and that's what makes it into a really good course. We've got a question here from Adam. Excuse me. How to work with huge groups of children and interest them when in a group we have poor and great students? It's a very good question, Adam, because you're talking here about having multi-level classes, and this means that we have to differentiate, and unfortunately I don't have time at the moment to go into that a great deal, but there are quite a lot of things that we can do that don't take up too much time to differentiate, and part of this is about giving people choice about what they do. Or you might say, okay, you need to do at least 5 items in this exercise, so they don't have to do all of them. Okay, and so people are working at their own level. So I hope that helps a little bit, but it's such a big question. Okay, and Magdalena also says big mixed ability groups of students are your reality. Thank you.
You must deal with the problem of mixed ability groups during your courses.
Yeah, we do. On several of our courses, both face-to-face courses and the online courses, especially something like teaching skills and systems, which is a great course for looking at more communicative ways of teaching, both teaching the 4 skills and teaching grammar and vocabulary. And in there we also look at classroom management and how to deal with things like that. Obviously it's going to come in with testing, evaluation and assessment as well, and also with teaching young learners too.
So I don't think we have any other more questions. I wonder how the online courses can help teachers to move their careers forward.
Okay, right, thank you. That's a good question, because what we find is that there are a lot of teachers. We've got some courses that are great for new teachers, like teaching skills and systems, teaching young learners, several of those. But we also find that quite a lot of the teachers who come on our courses have been teaching for quite a long time, and they might love teaching, but they also want to move their careers on a bit to something new. And the last two on that list are particularly useful. Materials development. This helps this helps teachers to either produce their own materials in class, or maybe they're producing materials for their institution, or it could even be producing materials for publication. So that really helps you to move your career on. And the other one is from teacher to trainer. After you've been teaching for quite a long time, maybe you find yourself helping new teachers or wanting to help them. And if that happens, this is a great course. We look at ways to observe teachers and give them feedback, ways to give them help, and ways to run workshops as well.
And we have one more question about certificates. That's true that in Poland, in order to improve your career and to prove that you are a great teacher, you need to collect certificates.
Yeah.
So, are there any certificates during your courses?
Sure. Yeah. At the end of your course, if you complete your course, at the end of it, you get a NILE certificate. And the course is 60 hours long, 60 hours long. And as long as you do 80% of the course, you get a certificate of participation. But if you do 80%, you can go on to do an assignment, and then you get a certificate of successful achievement, or a certificate of successful achievement with distinction. Okay. So yeah, certainly you get your certificates. Yes, they are paid courses, Alicia. And if you talk to Macmillan, you get this really great discount, 25% off. Yeah, I think it's important not to mix them up with things like MOOCs, massive online open courses, which are free, but there's really no comparison. You really can't compare them. It's a bit like the difference between reading a book and going on a course. Everybody's working very much together. You get lots of input from the tutor. All the courses have been written by very experienced trainers as well.
Exactly, yes. And please remember about the possibility of subsidizing the courses within the Erasmus Plus project. So if your school is running the project, make sure you in there, because it's really a great way of going to Norwich free of charge and taking part in those all fantastic courses.
Yeah, many of our students from Europe who come over have been completely paid for by Erasmus Plus. So we'd love to see more Polish teachers.
Yes, the deadline for this year, for next year, is the February, the 2nd of February. So you can contact the Erasmus Plus and find out about the courses, more details about it.
Yeah, and if you go onto our website, then there's a section there which is all about Erasmus funding. We give you a lot of help to make a successful Erasmus Plus funding application.
Yes, there is a
Alicia, yeah, if you look on the website, you'll see it.
Yes, D9. Maybe I give the address.
Do you want me to put it? I'll put it in. Sorry.
So, yes, that's the question. There is a whole guide how to apply through Erasmus. It can be found on the 9ELT.com webpage. This is ours. We do have info as well, but if you go on the 9 online, this 9ELT page, there will be a whole section devoted to Erasmus Plus programs.
Yeah, you need to look in the section that says funding. And if you look in there, it will tell you how to make a good, successful Erasmus Plus application. Are there any more questions?
So,
As I say, we'd love to see you on some of our online courses, and these all start on the 23rd of January, and they run for. You're right. I do need a rest, but they run. There are 8 units, and each unit lasts for 1 week, and we have a 1 week break in the middle, and then you have 4 weeks to do an assignment after that.
okay, so I think Johanna does need a rest, and she's so brave to be with us today. Thank you so much for your participation.
You're very welcome.
All the best.
Thank you, and to Tony as well.
Tony, of course. Thank you, Tony.
Yeah.
We will be bringing more of Nile experts to you by means of webinars, free webinars. So I can actually recommend the next webinar of Macmillan coming on the 12th of January about changes in the curriculum. So you can register now on our webpage. And thank you everyone for joining us. I wish you a fantastic weekend. It was lovely to read all your comments, and we are really happy that you are with us.
Thanks everybody. Bye. Goodbye from Norwich.
Bye from Warsaw.